so far. 174,052,215. That's the number of people who've been confirmed with COVID-19 so far across the world. And these are the latest figures according to Corona Tracker. 157,320,609 of them have recovered so far. But sadly, we've lost 3,744,029 people to COVID-19 across the world. In Kenya, these are the latest numbers according to the Ministry of Health. 172,491. That is indeed the number of people who have been confirmed with COVID-19 so far in Kenya since the first case was reported on March 13th of 2020. 117,595 people have recovered. Of course, that is both at home and in hospital. But sadly, we've lost 3,287 people to COVID-19. And this number continues going up. That's why we continue to urge you to follow the protocol set out by the Ministry of Health, which includes, of course, washing your hands or sanitizing as regularly as you can, of course, masking up at all times, and maintaining the 1.5 meters social distance. The 2021-2022 national budget, which will be presented to Parliament this Thursday. That's what we are talking about this morning, and we want you to be part of this conversation. That's why once again we ask you our question of the day. What are your expectations ahead of the presentation of the 2021-2022 national budget this Thursday? You can tweet us at NTV Kenya and at Victor Kiprop _ on Twitter. Be sure to use the hashtag #NewNormal so that we can see the tweets that you're sending us. You could also do the same on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, where we are streaming live. But just before that, let's give you a quick update of what else is happening across the African continent. And Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni on Sunday reimposed a strict lockdown that included closure of schools and the suspension of inter-district travel to help beat back a surge in COVID-19 cases in the country. The new measures will be effective from Monday morning and will include the closure of all learning institutions, the shutdown of weekly and open markets, and the suspension of communal or religious gatherings, and would be implemented for the next 42 days. The announcements of the restrictions came just hours after the country's Ministry of Health reported 1,259 new cases of COVID-19, the highest figure since the outbreak was confirmed in March last year in Uganda, pushing the total number of confirmed COVID-19 infections in the country to 52,935, with 383 related deaths. To the nearby DRC, and the international airport in the Democratic Republic of Congo's Goma region reopened on Saturday, 2 weeks after the devastating volcanic eruption of Mount Nyiragongo near the eastern city in the DRC. Prime Minister John Michel Sama Lukonde's plane touched down at the Goma International Airport on Saturday afternoon, signifying the reopening of the airport, which has been closed since May 23rd. 32 people died from lava burns or asphyxiation after the volcanic eruption, and 2 people died in accidents during the evacuation ordered by regional authorities. Roughly 400,000 people out of an estimated 600,000 residents left the North Kivu provincial capital following the eruption. And to bring us into the conversation of the day around the budget, let's give you a quick update of what is in the finance bill, which was, of course, presented in Parliament about a month ago. And the National Treasury wants the Kenya Revenue Authority to be granted powers to audit taxpayers for up to 7 years back, an increase from the present 5 years. This is one of the proposals contained in the Finance Bill of 2021, which seeks to help the Kenya Revenue Authority ramp up tax revenue in the financial year between July 2021 and June 2022.
In the financial year running between July 2021 and June 2022, the government has set an ambitious target of mobilizing 1.78 trillion shillings in ordinary revenue, placing immense pressure on the Kenya Revenue Authority to raise tax revenue. In a bid to help the authority realize the target set, the Finance Bill 2021 proposes a raft of changes, one of which is extending the period for which KRA can audit taxpayers to weed out tax cheats.
So presently, KRA can audit you up to 5 years back. So for example, we are talking about May 2021, which means Revenue Authority could potentially audit you way back until May 2016. Now, the proposal is to enlarge that 5-year period to 7 years. And I have to say here that Revenue Authority, under current law, can still audit you for more than 5 years if there is an element of fraud or if they suspect an element of fraud. So what we're seeing is we are now going back to what was their previous, pre-2015, before the Tax Procedures Act came into place, because the Income Tax Act had a 7-year time limitation. So we are now going back to the 7-year. So that just means that likely we're going to see a lot more audits into the future.
Taxpayers can also expect a breather when accounting for their wear and tear if the proposals in the Finance Bill of 2021 are endorsed by the National Assembly.
So the capital allowances provisions, I think, are a very good addition, in the sense that we now have, the proposal is to have these capital allowances claimed over equal installments. What we currently have is a reducing balance basis, so that, for example, if you've got a vehicle that is valued at 2 million shillings and the wear and tear allowance rate is 25%, you claim that amount on a reducing balance basis. What the proposal says is we shall now claim this over equal installments, which makes life a lot easier for taxpayers.
Persons engaging in the export of services such as the business process outsourcing should expect to be inconvenienced in the next financial year following changes proposed in the Finance Bill of 2021.
Business process outsourcing companies in Kenya will potentially be less competitive because they cannot claim their input VAT by virtue of supplying a VAT-exempt service. So whilst it clarifies the issue around the VAT status of exported services, I think it really makes this country competitive as far as business process outsourcing is concerned.
The Finance Bill of 2021 proposes to widen the definition of the digital marketplace to be any online platform, but to the relief of Kenyans, proposes that the digital services tax be only applicable to non-resident companies. Nayoma Sampao, NTV.
The 2021-2022 budget, which will be presented in the next 3 days before the National Assembly by the Cabinet Secretary of National Treasury, Ukur Yatani. That is what we are talking about this morning. What you expect, the estimates that have been, of course, presented before Parliament, and literally every other question that you have regarding this year's budget. And to help us, of course, break down this conversation this morning is Robert Wairuru, is the Associate Director at KPMG. Welcome to the show. Good to see you. And of course, as well as Churchill Ogutu, Head of Research at King's Capital. Churchill, good morning and welcome to the show.
Thanks.
All right, but just, gentlemen, before we get into the conversation, maybe we can give our viewers some quick numbers that will, of course, give them some context of the conversation. According to the, of course, the budget estimates tabled by the National Treasury before the National Assembly, this is the figure that we expect, the overall figure for the overall budget this financial year. We'll get to see, of course, if these projections will be indeed in the final presentation. Let's get to see how this money, indeed, the government plans to spend it in the next financial year, which begins July 1st to June 2022. And yes, in that budget, recurrent expenditure has been, of course, allocated 1.29 trillion shillings. 666.5 billion shillings will go into development expenditure and the consolidated fund services, which includes, of course, issues like pension payments and, of course, debt service obligations, has 1.32 trillion shillings, and, of course, allocations to the county governments, the 47 of them have been placed at 370 billion shillings. Of course, this is something that we have previously discussed after it was passed by the National Assembly and the Senate. We can now take a look at allocation to specific arms of government, and the executive will take 1.89, which is the lion's share of this budget, 1.89 trillion shillings. Parliament has been allocated in the budget, in the final budget estimates tabled in May, 46.1 billion shillings, while the judiciary arm of government has been, of course, allocated 17.92 billion shillings. So that's how the money will be spent in the next financial year, or how at least it's been planned to be spent. But how to finance or how to raise and finance this budget is where another problem comes in. Let's just try and see how this budget will be financed. And in the next financial year, which again I have to repeat, starts on July 1st, the national government projects that total revenue will stand at 2.04 billion shillings. I have to again put it in the simple language that this could easily, you could easily refer to the country's salary or the wages that it believes it can collect in the next financial year. And from this 2.04 trillion shillings, you can see 1.77 trillion shillings will come from ordinary revenue. But because the budget, as I mentioned, is somewhere around 3.6 trillion shillings, we will have a fiscal deficit of 952 billion shillings, which of course means the government will have to find money from elsewhere to plug this deficit. And according to the numbers in the budget estimates presented before Parliament, domestic debt or money borrowed locally will make up 661.6 billion shillings of that, and foreign debt will make up 291.3 billion shillings. Let's just give you some more important numbers, which are other key allocations in this budget, and that is 135 billion shillings, which has been set aside for the president's Big Four agenda. This figure was around 450 billion shillings, I believe, 2 financial years ago. But remember, this is President Uhuru Kenyatta's last budget in power. So this is the amount that has been, of course, put in place to maybe finish off those projects which the president has clearly prioritized under the Big Four agenda. And finally, because the economy is still reeling from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have this 26.6 billion shillings, another important figure that you should look out for, which has been set out for the post-COVID-19 economic stimulus program, which is essentially to just stimulate the economy to come back and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And let's just start our conversation of the day once again with the two gentlemen. My guest this morning, Robert Wairuiru, is an associate director at KPMG, as well as Churchill Ogutu, of the head of research at Genghis Capital. Gentlemen, it's good to see the both of you. Maybe from the facts that we have presented and the journey that we have traveled all the way from last year to the budget policy statement to the budget estimates presented last week and the finance bill, let me just first of all get your general assessment of this year's budget, Churchill.
Thanks, Victor. Looking at because it's a process, as you've correctly put it, the budget estimates to the national government in the budget policy statement, we're looking at 1.97 trillion. And what we have is slightly lower at 1.96 trillion. So that's a plus that you can see, you can give to the national treasury. Looking at the consolidated fund services, that's the big outlier here at 1.33 trillion. That just shows us how the public debt at 7.34 trillion, and then the servicing of debt is now one of the Achilles heel, if you may put it.
I think if you look at the figures we have presented, actually, it's actually overtaken development expenditure, which ideally we should be borrowing to fund development.
Yeah. So that's the Achilles heel. But having said that, we still have the Budget Appropriation Committee now to come up and give its recommendation on the budget. Who knows whether this budgetary allocation to the national government will surpass this 1.96 trillion. Who knows? It's something that we'll be keeping an eye on once Parliament resumes sometime tomorrow.
All right.
So that's what some of my highlights.
Okay.
Yeah.
Robert?
Thank you very much, Victor. So for me, what I found very interesting was the fact that there weren't really any new tax proposals per se, in terms of generating revenue.
Yeah.
And so what that tells us is that Revenue Authority will possibly be focusing on shoring up revenues from existing tax bases. In other words, to ensure that all of us are paying our fair share of taxes. So that really was one of the key highlights. But also another one is that, and this is something that we'll possibly talk about, is that we've got certain tax proposals from last year that are kicking in next month, 1st of July. So that is also something that government is looking at to raise revenues using those proposals that were already discussed last year.
Okay, maybe you can just start with those tax proposals that should be taking effect on July 1st.
Okay, excellent. So there are three key ones that people have already started talking about. One is 16% VAT on LPG, which is cooking gas. So you'll recall that last year there was debate around taxing cooking gas, and that was delayed by a year. So we expect that 1st July 2021, LPG will be subject to 16% VAT, and hopefully that will raise additional revenues. Then a second one, which I think is designed to capture politicians and the campaigning period, although one could argue that we're always in a campaign mode. But hiring helicopters will be subject to VAT. So I suppose that the taxman is looking to collect a bit more revenues when these politicians go around
heading for the 2022 elections.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is interesting. But just we'll come back to, of course, those specific issues in the finance bill and how they affect the ordinary mwananchi, including the issue of LPG gas, which I think we expect the price would be going up. But let's just start with the financing of this budget, because it's massive. It's bigger than last year's. If I'm not wrong, you can correct me for this, but it's our biggest budget, the biggest budget ever in our history. And that brings in the question of how are we going to finance it? I have seen here that according to the National Treasury, they believe they can collect 2.04 trillion shillings in revenue, which ordinary revenue should make up, I think, 1.78 billion shillings of it. That is a whole, if I'm not wrong, 182 billion shillings increase from the estimates for the last year. But from where the three of us sit, I'm sure we are aware of their history with making perhaps sometimes unrealistic, projections.
Right. So in my view, those are very, very aggressive tax targets that Kenya Revenue Authority is given. And in fact, one of the interesting things that I've noticed is that Revenue Authority sort of lags 1 year behind. In other words, if you look at the target that was set for, say, 20...
We are achieving it in the next financial year.
Exactly. So what that tells us is that perhaps we are a bit aggressive in terms of estimating the revenue targets. But also what it tells us is that there's a possibility of addressing these tax gaps and trying to show up those revenues. So indeed, it's something that I think would be possible to achieve for Revenue Authority. Victor?
Okay, so actually, let me just get your reactions to that.
Yes, as you correctly put it, we are looking at 182 billion increase in the ordinary revenue target. Obviously, we have the finance bill, which is looking at some new additional measures to at least finance that budget. Looking at the previous finance acts, Finance Act 2020, it had 39.8 billion to arise from that bill. And then looking at Finance Act 2019, it had 37 billion. Just looking at the Finance Bill 2019, that 37 billion was around 12% of the increase in the revenue. So I'm looking at this current budget, or this increase in ordinary revenue, 182 billion. Not all of it will come from finance bill, as Robert has earlier alluded to. Most of that will come from these ambitious projections in the economy, looking at the growth, so to speak. The next financial year, Treasury has said that they are looking at growth of average of 6.3% from 3.8%. So because of that increase in growth projections in the next financial year, so they also expect that even the income tax, the VAT, the excess duty will also grow in tandem to those growth expectations. What if it doesn't pan out?
Yeah.
And that is where...
And part of the problem there with projections based on these expectations is we are still in the issue of COVID-19. You've just seen what happened in Tanzania and Uganda. They are going back to stricter lockdowns. We have just come from ours, if I'm not wrong, I believe on the end of the month of May, after a whole month, which kind of raises the question of is it valid to have this optimistic view, especially when we are still in this context of COVID-19?
Yeah, and if I may take you back along this conversation, remember January, we had the reversal of the tax relief measures. And it was something that was people or the policymakers thought that we are out of the woods with this whole COVID-19 conversation. So that gave them the limelight to at least to revert back the tax relief measures that were there. But having said that, we still third wave, there's still some prospects or concerns that there'll be a fourth wave coming. So we are still not yet out of COVID-19. Unlike other countries in the developed world, whereby there are some incentives to people, right here, what we are seeing is now the reverse of that. So I think that even going forward, the people need to be a bit cautious in terms of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay.
We're still not yet out. Looking at the vaccination, I think you are running through the numbers.
Yeah.
2%, we are around below 1 million Kenyans have been vaccinated. So that's 2% of the population. Countries such as US, they are looking at 70% by July, at least to be able to get to herd immunity. So what are we talking about at around 2%? So I think we are still not yet out of the woods. And even these ambitious growth projections will come to haunt us if they don't materialize.
Okay. And part of the reason why those we had to reverse, or the government had to reverse some of those tax reliefs that were announced in May 2020 was because of part of the pressure from the people who lent to us, including the International Monetary Fund. Robert, just before we move into the specifics of what is in the finance bill, this year's numbers have sort of been agreed as part of that 38th month program with the IMF. And one would want to believe that now, once the Treasury and the IMF have sat down and looked at these numbers, it should make them maybe at least close to something realistic.
Yeah, in my view, Victor, if you look at what Revenue Authority has been able to collect between January and to date, actually those numbers have been going. I think the latest I've seen is 147 billion in the month of May. What that tells you is that clearly Revenue Authority is doing something, and government expects to still collect significant amounts of revenue. So if you think about extrapolating that over 12 months, assuming that performance is sustained, you're talking about maybe 1.6, 1.7 trillion shillings in ordinary revenue collected. And I think this is where they are coming from. They think that we supported the economy and we supported people using the fiscal expansionary policy. In other words, let's tax people less and retain more money in people's pockets so that we can stimulate the economy. And that was done for about 8 or so months last year. And now the government is saying it's now time to start rolling back these tax reliefs. And that's why you saw a rollback. And that's what IMF is also talking about. Guys, you've supported the economy sufficiently, we believe, and therefore let's move forward and collect the taxes. And I think that's where they're coming from.
All right. And definitely we want you to be part of this conversation. Remember, the budget will be presented on Thursday. Do you have your personal expectations on perhaps what the National Treasury should include in that presentation? Initially, they had asked you for your own views, and we want you to be part of this conversation. You can tweet us at NTV Kenya and at Victor Kiprop _. Tell us, what are your expectations for this year's budget presentation? Use the hashtag #NewNormal. You could also do that by sending us your feedback also on YouTube, Instagram and Facebook, where of course this conversation is live. And if you're not on social media, our lines will be on the bottom of your screen and you can call in and be part of this conversation. But Robert, you mentioned earlier that there are no significant tax proposals in this year's finance, but definitely there are those points of pain that anyone who's watching this conversation would want to know. What is that one thing that will affect my life as an ordinary mwananchi, as we'd like to refer them to?
I think the one that is very much talked about is ordinary bread. So there's going to be 16% VAT on ordinary bread. And as an individual, I really disagree with that proposal, and for a simple reason. We are 50 million Kenyans, as Churchill has said. So let's assume that each household is 5 people. So you're talking about 10 million households. Now, assuming that just 10% of those are able to buy a loaf of bread, and you're collecting roughly 8 shillings per loaf of bread. So you're, in a day, Revenue Authority, assuming that everybody is able to buy a loaf of bread a day, you're talking about 10 million shillings. 100 million shillings a day. So over a year, you're collecting about 3 billion. It's not a lot of money if you think about it. Yet it's such an emotive issue because a lot of people actually eat bread. And if you think about it, flour which is used to make bread is already subject to VAT. The oil that is used to make that is subject to VAT. The electricity is subject to VAT. So you are likely to see the cost of living skyrocketing. And I think that's really one that I would want or would request politicians or parliamentarians to really consider, because that's really an emotive issue for the common mwananchi.
And Churchill, speaking about the emotive issues, there's also the issue of infant milk.
Oh, infant milk, yes. That, I think, was part of the cleanup that were being done. A number of measures were now removed from the tax exempt. And I think specifically there's that aspect for infant milk, because there are a number of, under the VAT regime, there are a number of things which are classified as infant milk, but then they did, in my view, they did some cleanup. So what remains is now infant milk, but still might be subjected to higher taxes.
Robert, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, like Churchill says, it really was a cleanup. However, in the process of cleaning up, there are certain classifications of infant milk that were left out, and I think that might have been an error. So that, you know, those ones will now be subject to VAT. And if you think about it, one could see where the government is coming from, because if you think about the Breast Milk Substitutes Act, which encourages our mothers to breastfeed rather than to give formula. Yeah. That was the whole policy objective, in addition to the cleanup. But I think, like Churchill says, I think there was an error, or there were some omissions there. Just the same way we're talking about syringes. Again, a cleanup, but it looks like there might be some things that sort of slips through the cracks, and some of these things might be subject to
because
VAT.
that kind of brings some sort of contradiction on what exactly government is trying to achieve. For instance, and I was going through the finance bill, and this is something I noted, and they were trying to encourage adoption of renewable energy, and they were going to exempt specialized equipment for development and generation of solar, wind, and wind energy, of course, from VAT. But you also notice that LPG is now being exempt. Another thing that I saw, of course, being the fact that we are right at the middle of this fight against COVID-19, medical ventilators, diagnostic laboratory equipments, and reagents will be exempt. But again, syringes, which is a very important factor in this now that we are moving into vaccination, is being removed from the list.
Exactly. And by the way, one thing that is important to highlight here is that exempting products for VAT doesn't necessarily make them cheaper. Why? Because the manufacturers of these products are then not able to claim the costs that they incur in terms of VAT, because they're supplying a VAT exempt product. So the ideal scenario would be to zero rate. However, we do recognize that as a country, we've come from very far, where we had a long list of VAT zero rated products. And this is what IMF is saying. Can you reduce the amount of fiscal spend that you are directing towards tax expenditure? And I think in this country it's estimated to be around 6%. So 6% of our GDP. So you're talking about roughly 700 billion shillings spent on tax exemptions. And what IMF is saying is, look, let's rationalize these things. Let's exempt them instead of zero rating them. Let's subject them to VAT and redistribute the tax that we collect to the common mwananchi. And that really is the idea. But to your point around contradictions, it's not really a contradiction, because they are being exempted from VAT. So technically, you would expect that they would be affordable or more affordable to the common mwananchi. However, we are saying that by virtue of being exempted, they're not necessarily cheaper. Yeah.
Okay. And especially before I take to the views that some, of course, viewers have been sending us, from where you sit looking at all those things that we have explained, there is the worry that, from an ordinary mwananchi who has already been burdened, some of them have lost, some people have lost jobs, the tax reliefs that have been put in place have been reversed. Do we have the space to shoulder much more, of course, taxes going forward?
Obviously, that's a concern, looking at the environment that we are in, and where National Treasury is, the point that Robert had mentioned earlier on, that they are now finding some ways now to overtax even the people that are taxed, things to do with ordinary bread or the other VAT proposals in the finance bill. So I think Treasury is in a tight spot in the current environment in terms of coming up with proposals that people might feel that, okay, it's fair. But what we are seeing is proposals that are now burdening common wananchi. I saw there is some other proposals on the excise duty, things to do like removal of exemptions on confectionery or chocolate, local producers. This is something that had already been proposed in the Tax Laws Amendment 2020, but it didn't see the light of day. But right now, Treasury is still trying to bring it back. Things to do with motorcycles. Know that all over the Kenya, we find that they are border drivers. But right now, the proposal that is in is now from a specific rate of 11,000 thereabout to 15% of the price of that motorcycle. So we're likely to see that they'll be paying more duty, because if you work backwards, that 11,000 that is currently in place, it comes to around 77,000 thereabout for a price of a motorcycle. But motorcycles are slightly higher than that, so you find that the tax rate that the border guys will be subject to will be quite higher. So those are some of the things that are attuned to the common wananchi and are quite negative.
Okay. And before we, of course, continue this conversation, we'd like to see part of the feedback that you've been sending us. Remember, we asked you what are your expectations going forward, of course, ahead of the presentation of the budget on Thursday. And we asked our viewers from different areas in the country. Let's just get to see what some of them were saying.
Kuhusu mambo ya budget, naona kama ateremusha mafuta kidogo, kwa sababu hiyo ni budget ya mwananchi. Bila hiyo kuteremushwa, sione chochote taweza kusaidia mwananchi, kwa sababu niyo kitu, hiyo ni economy ya Kenya. Alafu vitu kama mambo kama vitu ya kusaidia mwananchi ateremusha kidogo at least, kwa sababu saa hii budget imeenda juu. Hata saa hii pile tunajikasa tu.
Tunapitia wakati mgumu, alafu kiangalia sasa hivi kutokana na corona, vitu zimekuwa expensive sana. Sasa hatuwezi jisaidia wenyewe, nafikia hatua parents anakosa hata pesa ya kutusaidia. Sasa tulikuwa tunahitaji kidogo government iangalie juu ya hili swala zima la wanafunzi, waone watakavyotusaidia.
Sisi tunataka tu budget kama tunaomba tu at least warudishe pesa ya chakula ikuje chini. Ndio sababu naona sasa hakuna kazi kwenye corona iko hivi. Kazi malipo imekuwa kidogo na nyumba imekuwa juu. Sasa lazima tungangane tu. Vikwazo.
Mimi ningependa kusema kuwa wapunguze taxes kwa basic commodities kama mafuta na vitu ambavyo watu wanaweza tumia kujisaidia.
During this COVID-19 pandemic, watu wameumia sana, wengine wamepoteza kazi, wengine wamepoteza biashara, imeenda chini, economy imeanguka kwa kila mahali all over the world. So na expect CS Yatani reduce hiyo taxes kwa hizo vitu common za wananchi, na pia vitu kama pombe, sigara waongeze hiyo taxes, because those are the basic things. Vitu zingine ni more important than kustarehe ama kulewa ama kufanya nini.
We have experienced lots of challenges and setbacks because of the COVID-19, and therefore I expect the CS to focus on supporting and revamping money to the businessmen and traders who have been affected by the pandemic. Put money there where there is production. The minister to focus on reducing wastage of money and put more in production in the industry, so that we get employment of our youths, we get production, we have food.
Kind of budget that we expect is a budget that will uplift the economy from where it is. Ukienda kila mahali unasikia kila mtu analia uchumi ni mbaya. Tunataka vitu ambavyo itasaidia kuinua uchumi. For example, we will expect a cut on taxes in fuel, because that is exactly where it is affecting the economy.
Mimi natarajia mazuri kwa hii serikali ituhurumie, especially sisi wa mama. Upande wa uchumi tunaumia sana. Sisi ndio tutategemewa, tupeleke watoto shule, tuwanunulie vyakula. Sasa hivi wanataka kurudi shule, yote inatuangalia sisi. So wakisoma hata upande wa unga watu consider mafuta nini vitu kama hizo, sabuni.
Matarajio yangu kuhusiana na bajeti ambayo itasoma hivi karibuni kwamba serikali, tafadhali tunaomba mtupunguzie mafuta ili vitu irudi chini, mwananchi wa kawaida anaumia, tafadhali tunaomba. Hicho ndio kile chetu kama wanabodaboda kutoka Kericho. Sawa sawa. Kwa hivyo rais pamoja na waziri wa fedha, tafadhali muhurumie wananchi. Mambo ambayo wamefikia ni mengi, hata watoto wanarudi shule kwa after tujua tutarudisha namna gani. Tunaumia sana sisi kama wananchi.
Expectation yangu katika mwaka huu wa bajeti, natarajia kwamba serikali itaweza kuangalia mwananchi wa kawaida, kwa sababu bei ya vitu vilikuwa vimepanda kwa sababu ya corona. Sasa saa hizi natarajia kwamba waweze kupunguza bei ya mafuta, bei ya vitu bidhaa kama vile sukari na kadhalika, ili ndio watu waweze kufurahia zaidi. Na pia ningependa serikali iweze kuangalia kwamba walimu wa Technical Training Institutes pia wanaajiriwa katika huu mwaka. Imekawia sana kwa muda mrefu, na hivyo basi tunaomba kwamba waweze kuangalia hiyo. Alafu mwisho waangalie pia vijana yafaa watengiwe pesa nyingi na waweze kusaidia kubuni ajira za kazi, kwa sababu wao ndio wanasaidia sana hii nchi kuendelea mbele.
Uchumi imekuwa expensive sana kwetu, so ila tunahitaji kama rais wetu, tunahitaji apunguze vitu kama mafuta, na mboga imekuwa expensive tena, maziwa kununua kwa viwanda imekuwa expensive. So tunahitaji kwa heshima yetu kama raia watupunguzie.
Kenyans from different walks of life and different parts of the country, of course, giving us their expectations for the budget presentation on Thursday this week. And some of you have also been talking to us on social media. Let's quickly get to sample what some of you have been saying on social media. Yes, Boniki, he who says, I'm scared that as a Kenyan youth, the future has been jeopardized by this regime. There's no hope for this. There's no hope in this country. Thank you, Boni. Gerard Njogo says, a lot of support should go to farmers in order to create more resources to the youth who have been affected by corona and went back to the reserves. Thank you, Gerard Njogo. Yes, can we get more? Yes. Sarara Emmanuel says, kila kitu itapanda obviously. Niko very prepared. Thank you, Emmanuel, for your feedback. And Derek says, so far so bad. They need to do something. Common mwananchi is suffering. Thank you, Derek. And Jose says, nothing to smile about. Gentlemen, of course, we're running out of time, but the last one, yes, we have Nick who says, chaos and more suffering. That is, of course, what some of you are expecting with the budget being presented by National Treasury CS this Thursday. Gentlemen, briefly, before we continue our conversation, let me just get your reactions. And part from the soundbites from parts of the country, I think the issue of fuel was very common in nearly all those soundbites.
Exactly, Victor. You see, fuel is a very emotive issue as well. Why? Because you need to move things in this economy. And therefore, irrespective of what you're doing, whether you're going to work, whether you're transporting farm produce, whether you're transporting people to their workplaces, fuel has a knock-on effect. And that's the reason why you see those reactions from people saying, can we please reduce the price of fuel? However, and you know, that's a legitimate concern. But if you think about it, fuel is still being taxed at 8%. So it's still sort of like a rebate. And I don't hold brief for government, but you can clearly see that the government is trying to do everything it can in terms of cushioning Kenyans by not subjecting it to the full 16% VAT. 16% VAT would be a disaster, I agree. Obviously, there's one very good point there that came through, which was reduce wastage. And really, if you think about it, the example we were just talking about there around bread, collecting 3 billion shillings in a year. According to the president, what the president said, we actually lose about that much in a day and a half. So you can imagine if you reduce the wastage, what it would mean for this country.
Churchill, and I think that's also part of what the IMF insisted in part of those conditions before the facility that we received in March.
Yeah, absolutely. They've been talking about reducing wastage, looking at transparency of issues, not only on the public debt, but also in terms of expenditure. And that's the right way to go about. But we are still part of the program. Just the other day we saw the review of the first review, which now led to the $410 million. But still, at least with the IMF program, it will be like checks and balance for the government in terms of implementing this not having corruption or wastage of.
And those conditions were quite a lot. Some of them included, some of the state-owned enterprises, the ones that government is holding so dear to, but they keep making losses year in, year out. And the conditions were you either privatize them or at least reform them to make them much more efficient. And that was, I think, in March. Do you think these things are happening?
And the National Treasury said by May is last month, that they'll give an audit of, I think, 15 SOE, state-owned enterprises, with a view of now restructuring them. We haven't seen anything around that regard. In that regard, at least separately, they've talked about 7 or 9 enterprises, parastatals. We are talking about Kenya Power. We are talking about KenGen, Kenya Ports Authority. We know which ones? 3 universities: Nairobi University, Moi University, and amongst another one I keep forgetting. But those were the ones that were identified in this part of the IMF. But Treasury said that they'll give a report of up to 15 or 20 parastatals. We haven't seen that, so we are still groping in the dark in regards to how the government will be able to restructure these parastatals.
Okay. And Robert, in March, before this facility was approved, or when it was in the process of being approved, something very significant happened, which is Kenyans voicing their concerns to the IMF. They stormed nearly every IMF live stream on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, just trying to pressure them not to, lend to Kenya. But part of this, the reason this was happening was because the public were feeling that the levels of debt in the country was really going up, and in a way, of course, affecting our lives in one way or another. But if you look at this year's budget, some 952 point something billion shillings in deficit, that means more borrowing.
Absolutely. We have to finance our budget through borrowing, and this is the reason why Kenyans were up in arms. And essentially, I think what Kenyans were saying is let's push for more accountability. There's nothing wrong with borrowing, by the way. In fact, Churchill here is an economist. He'll tell you that deficits in the order of about 5% of your GDP are generally the norm. And so there's nothing wrong with borrowing. The question is, when you borrow, what do you do with these funds? But I have to say here that the one thing that perhaps this administration has not gotten credit for is their investment in infrastructure. And I think my own view is that the succeeding administrations in this country will benefit tremendously from the infrastructure that has been built by this government, whether by borrowing or however you want to look at it. But there's that's the one thing that this government has done, and to my mind, they will open up the economy, and people will be able to trade more, and hopefully can drive the economy. But having said that, I don't think there's anything wrong with borrowing if you're using the funds wisely.
Churchill, briefly.
Yeah, I think what came out to the public was that the government is receiving 234 billion to 55 billion shillings from IMF, and that was a shock. But remember that this thing is staggered over 38 months. I will receive 34 billion in March, April. We are expecting to receive another 44 billion this month. So it's staggered over a period of time. But having said that, people even lose sight of the fact that in any given month, the government borrows from the domestic market through treasury bonds. In any given week, the government borrows 24 billion through treasury bills. So that is something that it doesn't come out to the public, because IMF, I think, was like a boogeyman in terms of the overall public debt. But the issue with the IMF was this issue to do with transparency, accountability of debt. That was what the angst of the public was directed towards IMF.
Okay. And of course, these loans have to be repaid. If you look at our debt servicing expenses for this financial year, the budget estimates praises it at 1.17 trillion shillings. That is already over 66% of what we should collect as revenue. I think up from 44% in the last 2 financial years. And it has already overtaken what we spend for development expenditure, which was 666 billion shillings. Briefly comment on that, Churchill.
And that is a concern. If you look at the current financial year, the last financial year, you find that the mid-year revisions, you see the domestic debt is revised upwards by 100 billion. So probably we'll be talking about 1.27 trillion next time, I don't know, 8 months down the line, as the public debt servicing cost. And that is a concern, that is a worry trend. And in the next financial year, we won't benefit from the debt service suspension initiative as far as I know, it's coming to an end by end of this month. We haven't seen a broad-based extension
because
of
that is what is
DSSI.
actually what SAFE does last year during this COVID, where revenues were very slow. Do we have any latitude for a much more debt suspension this year?
So far, we don't have. And we received debt suspension to the tune of 58 billion shillings. But having said that, we had an increase of 100 billion in terms of debt servicing for domestic debt. So it negated even the DSSI that we received. So going into the next financial year, we don't have the DSSI, so we'll still be having an elevated debt servicing cost, which will now, have some negative ripple impact of the budget execution.
Churchill, just briefly, what is the best option then to move forward from this situation, the fix that we are in?
Well, I think we just have to crawl slowly. We can't just have a single bullet or way of getting out of this hole. But we just need to look at the long term. How are we able to execute the budget? If I take you to the current financial year, the budgetary disbursements so far between the first 9 months was around 1.7 trillion shillings, and that's for 9 months, and yet we're expecting to disburse 1.1 trillion in the last 3 months. So 65% of what was disbursed in 9 months is expected to be done in 3 months. So it tells us that budgetary absorption is quite low. That's one thing. Remember that this month we're expecting to get 82 billion from the World Bank. We expect a Eurobond, 123 billion shillings. We expect 13 billion from Africa Development Bank. We expect tax collection, which June normally is a high month in terms of collections. So all this is coming up in a single month, but we don't think that we'll be able to absorb them. So most likely, if they all come into this month, we'll have to cross over into the next financial year with balance carried forward, close to around 200 billion or 300 billion, and that is a concern. So budget implementation is quite low, and it tells us that we don't have to go into this 3.6 trillion budget that we're looking at. We can cut our cloth according to size, even close to 3.2 trillion, which is a bit realistic, looking at the statistics that you're having. So that is where we can be able to at least trim this overambitious budget that we're looking at.
Gentlemen, we're definitely running out of time and we have to close the conversation. But quickly, the economy really took a big hit from COVID last year. We slumped into recession, I think, for the first time in a decade, if I'm not wrong, or 2 decades, if I'm not wrong. And that means part of our budget should also, in a way, sort of stimulate the economy and put it on a recovery path. So looking at maybe what is in the finance bill and even the taxes from last year, 26.5 billion shillings is what has been set aside for the post-COVID-19 stimulus. Do you think there are specific issues in the budget that are helping indeed us in that trajectory?
I think in summary, Victor, what I would say is that given that there are really no significant new taxes in this finance bill, I would say that the government has tried to support the economy in terms of post-COVID recovery. They did that for the last 8 months of the year, or last year, and you can clearly see that by not introducing additional taxes, there are very few taxes that have come through. The government is still trying to support the recovery of the economy. So for me, the 26 billion together with about 172 billion in terms of foregone taxes and what have you last year is a pretty good shot at supporting the economy. Okay.
Churchill, are there specific areas, briefly, specific areas we should target this money to make sure that we are on that path of recovery?
Specifically for the post-COVID economic stimulus program, the 26.6 billion, I think it's been split to stimulate liquidity, I think 11 billion. There's some monies that is going to hire teachers, there's some monies going to health interns, and then some money to KWS. But having said that, and looking at the post-COVID economic recovery strategy, this is a document that came in November last year. I find it was done in like a bicycle manner, in the sense that it was just put out there, a draft document. We haven't seen the final document to it. And then it was a bit hazy. There are some proposals that had received some pushback from the public. Case in point is this suspension of debt or interest payments to the pension funds. That was one in that proposal. So I think that the government hasn't really put forward this post-COVID economic recovery strategy. Hence, even this 26 billion from a budget of 1.97 trillion that is going to the national government, 26.6 billion is a drop in the ocean. So more has to be done to stimulate the economy.
Okay. Gentlemen, what a wonderful discussion we're having, and definitely we have to wait for Thursday to see for ourselves what will be tabled by National Treasury CS Ukur Yatani in Parliament. Let me just, in 30 seconds each, let me just get your closing remarks each. I'll start with you, Churchill.
Well, it's ambitious budget we're looking at, 3.6 trillion. We still have the Budget Appropriation Committee to table its report. So that will also put things up and running from tomorrow. Finance bill, the Finance Committee has to table this report. We're likely to see what it will be able to recommend. There are some things that Robert has said, things to do with ordinary bread, which most likely might be might not see light from that committee. So just wait and see.
Okay, Robert?
I think we expect to see a more aggressive revenue authority to collect these very ambitious revenue targets. Really, that's what Kenyans should expect.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We have been talking about the 2021-2022 financial budget, overall national budget, which will be tabled before Parliament on Thursday by National Treasury CS Ukur Yatani. Many thanks to my guest this morning. Robert Waruiru is an Associate Director at KPMG, as well as Churchill Ogutu is the Head of Research at Genghis Capital. We have to take a very quick break, but when we come back, remember it's June 7th, which means it's World Safety Day. So when we come back, we talk about the safety of food in our country and why it is important to you, to me, and you.